we're going to go through, so as I said, some of the features that we've been thinking about. Some of these things will be really familiar because we've been talking about them for a long, long time. I know I mentioned this earlier this morning. There's a lot of things that we've talked with many of you about that we've sort of, until we get the new student interface, there's a few things that we can't really do yet. But now there's some of those things that we really would like to start looking at, and we just want to understand, get a bit of a sense from the group, what's the priority, what order should we do this? So these are all things that are probably going to happen over the next little while, but certainly in the next 12 months, which ones should we put on a priority from your perspective? So we'll let you have a discussion sort of with your institution, but we're trying to make it kind of as sort of, I guess it's more electoral college than it is proportional voting. So just because you've got lots of people here doesn't mean you get lots of votes. So we're doing a little bit more that way. So I've broken down each of these things into, I guess, the more kind of the stakeholder that it impacts the most. So one of the things that I know I've talked about with quite a few of you, and we can go into sort of examples of what we think it might be, but most of these are just going to be descriptions, and then we'll go through what we mean by that. And if you've got any questions, if you want to talk through it or what it might impact for you, we can do that. Matt's got the microphone, so if anyone's got a question, just stick your hand up. So per week allocation options. What I mean by that is when we have activities where we might want to actually, like pass groups and study groups and drop-in groups that we want to have, not every student needs to attend every single week, but we want to let them allocate based on their actual attendance on a weekly basis. So we're not allocating to a series of activity events, we're just allocating to the dates that we're going to attend. And what we would have around that, part of the design that we've formulated, is that it would allow you to define what's the minimum number that someone needs to attend, whether all students have to get 1 week at least, those sorts of things that we can we can put some rules and constraints around it, but really being able to opt in and out per week rather than just having that full series of activities in the traditional kind of timetable sort of semester-based sense. So I don't know if anyone's got any particular thoughts about whether they think that might be a priority for themselves or why they think it is. If you want to start kind of advocating for other people to put their pebbles in that particular bucket, then we could go from there as well. So each of these buckets are going to be labelled with these functions that we come up with. And we'll leave these up. We can have the discussion as we get through the different ones as well. We'll vote at the end. Yeah, so we're going to go all through it. So there's 7 different functions that we're going to look at. And then we're going to have 7 buckets up here that you can distribute your pebbles however you want to. You can put them all in one bucket. You can sort of balance them around, or you can spread it to where you think your priorities are. Everyone should have the same number of pebbles, by the way, too. If you've got less than, what was the number we had? 13, I think? 16. 16, I think it should be. So if anyone is claiming shenanigans, let me know, and we'll make sure everyone's got the right number of pebbles. Being able to set your own time, particularly for online classes. So this is something that I know I've talked to quite a few people about. I think we discussed it a little bit today. We saw that with the new student interface, we can now essentially drag activities into where at the moment, where they're scheduled. So it tells them where they can drop it based on where we've timetabled the activity. But for online activities, one thing that has come up in the past is, what if we don't have a particular time? We might have a time that we've recorded it, but as long as that student consumes that content at some point before the next session, then that's okay. So we'd again want to set some rules around that sort of stuff, where it would be allow the student to set their own time for a particular activity or activity type, but have some constraints around it. So if it's recorded on a Tuesday morning, then it has to be somewhere between Tuesday and Monday that they put it in their calendar. But then it would still be a clash-free time. It would still ensure that the student is making sure that they've got space for that content in their timetable as well. So that's another one that we've been seriously considering around those not necessarily time-based activities that students can set their own time for. Multi-seat allocation. So I know this was one that I was really interested in when, I can't remember, a couple of clients I think have mentioned this to me in different discussions that we've talked about. So students with accessibility requirements might often need multiple seats. So you might have to have a scribe that comes with you. You might need a little bit more space, all that sort of stuff. So we can look at, from a scheduling perspective, making sure that we've got accessibility capability within a location, so the activity has that capacity. But then from that point, are there students that qualify to essentially allocate to multiple seats, or are there students that only qualify for certain activities based on the location accessibility requirements? So a bit of both of that would be around what we just, and these topics that we're calling them are kind of just for today to say what to put them into buckets. So the multi-seat allocation process is that students that need more than one seat, in simple terms. Cool. So then thinking from staff perspective and looking at like, I guess the structure of the things that we're offering for students. So the concept of activity groups that are not necessarily related to a particular subject enrolment. So this is where you might have things that are like, again, a bit like pass or drop-in sessions, but it might be that there's qualification based on you could be enrolled in any number of subjects. So you could say if your unit code matches whatever, if you're from a particular department, if you're tagged as a first-year student, we can have all sorts of different requirements that qualify students for them to then have these activities as optional activities they can add to their timetable. So I know one use case that I've been shown about that one is often for first-year students, they have a few extra orientation type classes at the start of semester, which is not necessarily about what course they're enrolled in or what subject they're enrolled in, but it's more about them being first years, that we want them to have options to go to different things. So it's kind of introducing that concept, and this is where we start to think about, like, there is quite a lot of method to the madness of what we've done around the student interface, because if we think about that section where we're dragging activities from, we've specifically not referred to that as an enrolment section. That's really just all of the available activities and events and things that you can add to your timetable. So it may be that this particular student is eligible for something that other students are not necessarily eligible for. And again, that might even be something that's a per week allocation too. So we can get right down to some combinations of some of this stuff. But the concept of a set of activities that we can, within Allocate Plus, decide which students are eligible for them, rather than relying on the enrolment data that comes through for the students. Some additional base sort options. So around the base sorts that we've got, obviously we've done a little bit of work around the outcomes and the calculations and always working on the algorithm. Bo Roos and his team would do a lot of work around that. But in terms of the input and the setup of the base sorts, this is something that we did talk about when we first floated the new type of sorts a few years ago, was being able to, one of the two sort of key parts to it. One was to be able to balance activity usage. So what I mean by that is where we've got a number of activities. So it really would, we probably would initially envisage that would apply to what we've always referred to in the past as forced sorts. So the ones where we're not considering preferences, we're just trying to maximise allocation of students, where we want to optimise usage of activities potentially as well. So we might say, and it could work both ways, that we say we want to use all of our activities efficiently. If there's 10 activities, we don't want to have 8 with 30 students in them and 2 with 5 students in them. We want to spread everybody out. Or we might say, I want to use as few activities as I possibly can. Let's group them in and bundle them up so I can use only 8 of those activities, and the sorts will still optimise which are the best allocations to make to know which activities to drop to still be able to, or to leave empty to still be able to optimise the students that we can get allocated. So I think there's sort of those two flavours to that, where we could say we want to balance the students across all the existing activities that we've scheduled, or we want to make sure that we use as few activities as we possibly can. And that might be different for different groups. We might have different settings around that too. So that is an additional base sort setting when we're kicking off sorts, that we can have those extra kinds of options as well. And then from the admin side of things, we've got scheduled actions. So this is one that's come up over the years multiple times. Can I set the modes to change? And I'm looking at Santi, I think you guys have asked about this a few times. Can we set the modes to change before it's going to happen? Can I decide that on date X at time 9 a.m. or these particular groups are going to change mode? We've always, I guess, my hesitation on that in terms of like making sure that it works for everyone is that we need to understand the rules if something changes in between setting that date as well. So we'd have to put some safeguards around it. But we think it is definitely something that has potentially got quite a bit of merit, and we've got a pretty good design around what we want to do. So things around mode change at activity group level and the actual status of the student interface as well. So we could actually set it to turn on at a particular time in the future, or we could set the modes to change at a particular time in the future. So that's something that, again, scheduled actions is kind of a bit of a loose term to say we want to be able to do it time-based, not have to log in and do it at the time. So we have to also think a little bit, as I said, what sort of safeguards would we want to put in place around that? So, for example, if a particular group or set of groups are set to be subject to a scheduled action, then we might say, well, if someone then changes the mode after I've set a scheduled action, that might actually remove them from that schedule. So if we want to move everything from read-only to preference entry on a particular day and time, and someone moves it to off, then that would potentially remove that from the group. That's the sort of safeguard that I'm talking about when I'm saying, do we want to make sure that it's not just going to do things that we don't really predict or expect in the future, or whether we lock the mode change after that schedule's been set too. And that's something that's a little bit different for different unis, because I know quite a few of us will do it all centrally. We'll manage that, particularly mode changes is probably the key one. Others might let their faculties and departments do that to a certain degree as well. So it might be a little bit of an opt-in, opt-out kind of scenario. But we wanted to get a sense of where people have that in their priority list as well. And user management, user and permission management. And I know that's something that our guys help everyone out a lot with. Obviously updating the concept of between the system profiles and permissions to subject profiles and permissions and the user management. So obviously now that we've got the Plus suite available for people, Schedule Plus, where we've got staff that are listed, they are automatically recognised in Allocate Plus, so then we can look at consolidating those permissions in terms of the system and subject permissions for those users to be able to get that sort of easier management of that stuff and be able to do things a bit more in bulk and do things a bit more consistently too. So those are the 7 key areas, and we've got these 7 buckets up here. They're all labelled to refer to those. I'm going to leave those up on the board while we do it. As I said, Matt's got the microphone, so if anyone wants to sort of talk about any of those as you're thinking about voting and thinking about where your pebbles want to go, and I think I just saw Suzanne grabbing the microphone too, so have a discussion with your group about where you want to split those pebbles out, or any questions that you've got around any of those as well. Yes? We'll get the microphone just so everyone can hear, Daniel, yeah.
Thank you. I was going to say, with consolidating user permission management, what did you have in mind? Like, have it just all in the one screen so that you create the user, and then underneath you can add as many groups as you want.
Potentially, exactly right,
with a group and a role.
So when you're looking at a user, you can see their subject group and their system profile and their permissions, so you can do it all within a user management interface.
Yeah.
It's more about bringing all that together in one spot, as opposed to changing the way it works.
Yeah, doing it in 2 different screens is
it's tricky,
pain.
Isn't it? Yeah, it's a pain in the butt. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, and that's why we've had it on the list of things that we wanted to look at. Yeah. If you can convince, I don't know if William, you two are negotiating, what's more important between the two of you?
So for the per week allocation options, so you're thinking like, say we could have like concurrently running online on campus class, students can nominate which week they're going to be attending on campus, which week they're going to be attending, something like that.
Potentially, that'd be a sort of another use case. These are more ones that might be just a different scenario. So students need to attend, this thing runs for 12 weeks, every student needs to attend 3 weeks of this. We don't care when they do it. So there's teaching that fits that category, and there's teaching that fits the category you've talked about as well, which I think we could cater for both if we have that per week allocation concept. Yeah. Yeah, Jag? Yeah, the buckets are ready, so if you're ready with your pebbles, you can come up and place them in the buckets that you prefer. Yes, Jagdish.
Sorry, what is multi-seat allocation?
Sorry?
Multi-seat allocation, what is that? Multi-seat allocation. The third one.
Oh, multi-seat allocation. So that's where students need to be allocated more than one seat in the class. So they might have a scribe that works with them. So if I'm blind and I need someone to read to me, then I might need an extra seat, where it's not for an enrolled student. It's actually just for that student, they need to get an extra seat.
Yeah, another case for that would probably be...
So I think Mara had a question
interpreters
too.
would be another case for that as well. Auslan interpreters.
Sorry?
Auslan interpreters would be another case. So anyone that's hard of hearing or deaf might need a seat for the interpreter to sit in.
Exactly right.
Another case for that multi-seat.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, Mara. Mara, did you have a question as well?
So the non-enrolled activity group, I'm assuming that works both ways. We can have exemptions as well as selected students in. Can we say everyone except this group of students?
Yeah, so I think we could put multiple layers to that. So we might say students who are enrolled in this unit, as long as they don't have this tag or that category, or so we can have rules applied to that. Or a list of students, say you're ineligible for that.
Or just a list of students, because things like students that are exempt from a lab.
Exactly right.
You don't need to do the lab, and they wouldn't even see the activity.
Yes.
Oh, that would be great.
Yeah, that's what we'd be thinking. So it's kind of the reverse of that. So the ones that do need to do the lab would actually see it, and the others wouldn't know about it. So I got that question just for everyone else. The conversation I just had with Warwick was just around, for the non-enrolled concept, that the activities can be based on, so we've been looking at this with Schedule Plus in terms of ad hoc activities that we can then make available to students via just really simple integration, or through a different import mechanism that we would have. So if you don't have the full Plus suite, we may still look at being able to import activities with essentially a flag to say that Allocate Plus can decide students to be eligibility for that. So it's not going to be linked to a subject necessarily. We'll link it to students to make them available. So that's the way we look at it. So this is now, we're sort of at the portion, the last kind of hour of the Allocate Plus day for the conference is really where we turn it over to you guys. So this is where we want to have, we'll sort of split this into roughly two parts where in terms of the types of stuff we've just done, so we presented some stuff we've talked about in the past that we've sort of semi-designed, we've worked out how we can achieve these sorts of things. Now we want to think about if there's things that we haven't listed here, and we've got the team taking notes, we're going to record this session. What we'll probably do is we'll put all this together based on the discussion that we have over the next 20 minutes or so, just to be able to essentially produce another list, and we'll distribute that out through the user group forum so that we can have a similar sort of voting thing to sort of look at what might be the next set of priorities based on what comes out of this discussion as well. And I know that's something that we take a lot of pride in, is that we work all together collaboratively with all of you guys so that we can make sure that the product is moving in a direction to support the types of scenarios that you're being presented with and the types of things that we want to have as part of the student experience for Allocate Plus. So please don't be shy. If you've had a thought, if you've had someone suggest something to you that you think is a good idea in Allocate Plus, or if you've said something to us over the last couple of years that we didn't put on this list that you say, hey, I told you about this thing and you haven't mentioned it, we can have a bit of a discussion about what it sort of would look like for other people as well. So Matt and Suzanne have got the microphones. Warwick's going to go first. Thank you, mate.
Which one do you want?
Well, yeah, you've usually got a list for us. Absolutely.
These are off the cuff. The first one we already discussed last night. I don't know how many other people are having this problem, but we're starting to see more requests to keep a couple of students separate so they can't allocate to the same classroom for safety reasons. We can obviously do workarounds about it, but it does mean that we're manually having to monitor that during the scheduling allocation process. So
yeah, and we had the discussion, didn't we, that the closest thing we've currently got to that is really the Spark type thing, where we can pre-allocate students and then get warnings if anyone tries to move them. But as Warwick and I discussed, sometimes we get this scenario where, and I'm not sure if it's really at the class registration allocation step that we should be kind of saying that's the only place we do this, but that's where we're being presented with the issue of we just have to make sure these two students stay apart, but we want them all to have the same experience. And that's where it becomes a bit of a tight balance, doesn't it?
Yeah. Another one had just come to me. If you're a student who might have a particular issue, say they need a sit-stand desk or they need wheelchair access. Now, most of our rooms should all have wheelchair access and things, but they won't necessarily all our rooms have sit-to-stand desks.
Yep.
And is there a way we can have a location attribute that would flag that there was something in that room? Now, what doesn't actually have to be sit-to-stand desk. It could be hearing loops or whatever it is. So when the students go into allocate, that they know which rooms they potentially could get it. If you've got 100 activities and only 5 have got sit-to-stand desks, then you would probably want to prefer that.
Yeah, I think we could have things around like sort of almost like accessibility information. I know that's something I've discussed, I think, with Sydney in the past as well, that almost like a fly-up that says, well, this location is compatible with these types of accessibility requirements. It's something we've tried to toy with, but it's a matter of how much do we store against the student allocation data that we actually all we really need is certain amounts of stuff. For those that are here tomorrow, we actually talk a little bit about what we refer to as the student accommodations in the exam space. So that's where we can actually match students' requirements to the requirements of the event itself. So we could start looking at something similar to that in the Allocate Plus space at some point as well. So I think that matching of students to their requirements and which activities.
Yeah, and look, it is difficult because a lot of cases that some of those decisions or say equitable learning plans don't arrive until after we've allocated, but it would be.
Even if it pointed out an issue, if it could be reported on for you.
Or at least identify where we have, it would just be, maybe potentially a better way for the students so that they can put their preferences in and know that the chances are if they're in the first 4, they know which rooms they potentially can get to.
Yeah.
Or at least bring it up early for us.
It's a really interesting concept, and I think that that's something that, because obviously not doing the scheduling within the Allocate space is where we sort of say, well, how much data and extra information should we be presenting to the student? What becomes like white noise if you have too much info that they're trying to troll through? And that's what we're trying to strike that balance of having all the information that certain students need without overloading all the other students who don't necessarily need all that information all the time.
And you don't necessarily want the students to obviously use it as to have their option to turn on things saying,
I think it'd be a per student, like you'd have a category of student that can see that extra kind of stuff potentially. Yeah, I think that's quite a good idea. I don't know if others have come across those similar sorts of. Kathleen,
I was just going to comment on it that we do actually have quite a lot of equity students at our university, and one of our campuses is quite old and retrofitted, so a lot of the rooms aren't wheelchair accessible.
Yep.
And some of our students would need wheelchair accessibility. So those students are manually allocated by the school administrators into rooms that have wheelchair accessibility. And I guess, obviously that's an onerous task, and I was sort of kind of more thinking, based on that idea, it'd be good for some sort of automation, but maybe on the staff end. So rather than students being able to find the accessibility rooms, but making something, if a student's flagged needing accessibility in the back end, then it automatically makes
when you go to allocate them, you only have the options that match potentially.
Yeah, something like that. Just something that just sort of kind of streamlines those options.
I think it could nearly be like a back end constraint. Like it's not an active constraint, but when the student doesn't match to, if we've got some settings in there around, because it really becomes down to the activity then. So any activities that are in locations that don't meet certain criteria would potentially not be available for those students where we've identified that. Yeah, so I think we'd probably want to have both ends to that. And I think you're right, potentially even from a staff perspective might gain more value because we can have more information available while we're allocating students as staff where we don't want to overload the student interface too much without the need to do it. Yeah, that's a good call.
Yeah.
Donna.
So we actually had a situation this year where we had an accessibility student. We changed the schedule to meet that student. We had no way of actually locking it in Tonto or Allocate Plus to go, don't do any changes to that because that's where the student is.
Yep.
Unfortunately, we got another request from somewhere else
to move that activity.
Change.
Yeah.
Because we couldn't tell that should not have been touched.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure.
So for the next few months at least, you can't quite pin your activities and lock them in your schedule. But at some point in the next year, yes.
I'm thinking like with some of the stuff that everyone's just been raising about accessibility students, it's like if the student moves, the locking then doesn't apply, and we've sort of got to somehow connect it to the student but also lock it to the activity in Allocate Plus so that we protect it. But if that student then went in and said, well, I know you've done all this work around and I really appreciate it, but I just want to move over there, then that lock doesn't apply. So I think there needs to be some scenarios of how do we do
It's a bit of a
this.
combination, isn't it?
It is.
So at the moment, obviously, when you're manually allocating, you can disallow the student changes. So once they're allocated, and I'm sure this is, again, one of those workarounds that we've kind of talked about, Warwick, that we can kind of do, is that when we allocate, we can make sure that they can't move themselves. But if the activity moves itself, then that could be the challenge, isn't it, Donna?
Yes.
Yeah.
And I know sometimes we go, we don't want to put too many notes here and too many notes there when we're trying to get systems that flow. But sometimes we need to have these ticks on and off. But then we go, well, what was the reason for that and who did that?
Yep.
And so if we don't have the audit trail to understand who is doing it and for what reason, it sort of then creates a situation if somebody else comes behind, they go, well, what was that? Why is that locked?
Yep.
So...
And I think you're right, it's not necessarily, so some activities in terms of the schedule, I'm probably overflowing into Mark a little bit here with Schedule Plus, but when we're pinning activities that can't be rescheduled or changed, do we have, this is like as a different category of pinning? So there's just pinning them because we've already reset them, or there's pinning them because we've got students that are relying on them not moving. And that's two different categories.
Yeah.
And I think we always try to have categories of things rather than have like a generic thing that then has a note to go with it, because that often has the challenges around it, doesn't it?
Right.
Yeah.
And so that's why it's like sometimes I wonder if there's an option that if we did lock it and we've worked around and done the work for this student, the student should not have the access then to move themselves out of that activity to protect the schedule. Like they need to have a discussion with the appropriate people so that you can unlock everything correctly. So that was just one of the ones I wanted to put up.
Yeah, and for that scenario, do you know, and maybe you don't, it's probably a Rachel, it might even go back to being it's probably a Sarah or Dennis question from the last few years of, are we using that disallow student changes? Not extensively. I suspect we're probably not. Not a lot of unis are using it extensively, because it is something that when you're allocating students as a staff member, you do have to actively kind of make that decision at that point as well. Yeah, cool.
We found students that they want to allow themselves a clash.
Yep.
We try to avoid.
Yes.
For example, they're like, so for example, they're going to one unit that there's only one option. Okay, one tutorial in Monday 10 a.m. And they have another lab, and they could go Tuesday, Wednesday, Monday, but they want on Monday, and they want to have a clash.
Right.
So a lot of the time they schedule themselves from the only option, and they put themselves on the lab, and after they request a clash, but we're like, you have other options.
You've got other options that you didn't have to tangle yourself up.
So we allocate you on the only option, and we make it that you cannot move.
Yeah, okay.
That's where you are going. There's no other option for you.
Yep.
You need to try to have a non-clash timetable.
Yeah.
That's why we're trying to do. That's why we put student centers.
That's why we got Allocate Plus, isn't it?
Like, man.
That's why we do all the work that we do. Yeah.
Okay. If you have work commitment or something, that's different. But it's just a lot of them is like, I don't want to come on another day at uni.
And this is often one of those things that it probably feeds into some of the other things we've talked about too, that often it might be a clash because the lab runs for 1 week or the lecture runs for 1 week. So if we can have that per week allocation and having that opt out, if we can float our times around and move, if it's, I can watch the recorded content 2 hours later, that's fine. So I think a lot of these things start to dovetail into each other a little bit too.
But we did use this quite a lot this semester, especially for these ones that they are only one option.
Yep.
Because we found a lot of the students playing with this and enrolling from that.
Yep.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
I had to schedule safety breaks in one unit. Safety breaks.
Yeah,
so
right.
that there were students that were, we haven't used the scheduled students for a limited amount of time because we do have, because we have been also, as you say, dovetailing, we have been scheduling reminders, right, instead of a reminder, listen to your recorded lecture online, instead of a floating, but that means that will extend a student's day.
Yep.
So then I've been scheduling safety reminders so that students are forced to take a lunch break in between particularly tedious units. And so it's the first year visual arts students who schedule themselves for 8 hours without a break.
Yep.
And who are doing very physical work and learning physical skills in dangerous environments. So things like that is where we've been using that. Don't deallocate yourself.
Yep.
So that they can't force themselves into a clash.
Yeah. So, and I wonder if that might even, and I was sort of thinking off the top of my head, is that as a scenario that if we can look at potentially some sort of more dynamic rules around the way we have that kind of the maximum consecutive hours and the maximum span type stuff, if it can be maybe a little bit filtered down for certain cohorts, that it might not necessarily be a global thing that we could define for certain cohorts. I wonder if that's something that might be of interest to others as well. And we can put that on the list of things that we put out for a vote later on too. Warwick, you got another one?
Yeah, I've got a list another one.
That's good. That's good. We got plenty of time.
So
what time's dinner? Does everyone pay attention? Okay, good.
Hey, that's what I'm here for. So at the moment, when you want to lock a student in and they've already allocated, my understanding is the process you have to deallocate them and then reallocate them with the flag on.
So you want to lock?
Oh yeah.
While they're allocated?
Yeah.
I think that's a really good suggestion. Yeah, I think that's something we could probably think about for sure.
Across the whole area, for example.
Yeah, so we could select the whole. We could select a whole cohort, a whole course. So we could do it by student, or we could do it by subject, and we can say let's lock all the allocations for that selection. That might be. Does that sound of interest? Sounds pretty cool to me. Yeah, I think that'd be something we could probably look at for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, so we have an issue with subjects that don't allocate their students until right at the start of session.
Yep.
I'm just throwing the proverbial to see what will stick, basically. But so yeah, we're always constantly looking for rooms, and we're looking for rooms with zero allocations. But then we have these classes that have zero allocations that we can't steal rooms from, basically.
Right.
So if there was some way that, I don't know, maybe projected allocations or something, maybe, so we could identify a class or. Yeah,
So I guess I'm thinking of what we've got currently and where we can sort of expand from that. Are these so they would be enrolled and just not allocated?
Enrolled, not allocated.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So you'd still be, I guess, technically underutilised.
Yes.
You'd be seeing a lot of unallocated sort of counts. But there's often different layers to that too. There's some that just haven't allocated their cohort, as you've described, and there's some that, only a portion of those students have it, and that's a different category, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm interested what people's thoughts are about what we could maybe think about there in terms of, I guess, are we almost wanting to, almost like, I keep using the word tag, but something to sort of recognise that these activities that have a different timeline to others, almost. Yeah, I'm wondering.
Just
Where are we, sorry?
thinking in terms of how...
Oh, Gareth, sorry.
Yeah. Just thinking in terms of how a student would use my timetable, and especially the new student interface. I think what really commonly happens at the moment is I'm a student, I get my allocations, I either screenshot it or subscribe it to my calendar and never open it
Never go
again.
back.
Yep. So I don't see changes, I don't see any announcements. Do you think it's a direction possibly to have my timetable replace other calendar apps by allowing students to create their own activities in their timetable or set notifications for themselves for when events are coming up?
Yeah, so we certainly do have the concept. So, and part of creating your own events is really in that it's sort of semi-linked to the connection side of things where you can create your work groups, so they can create events in there so that they can share with connected students, but also just for themselves potentially as well. Having that as part of an iCal feed is obviously something that we'd want to have in terms of like the student full kind of visibility of everything I'm trying to do during a week. But then the concept also about notifications and triggers and those sorts of things, and we possibly will talk about this a little bit tomorrow, but the API framework looks at a lot of the events that impact students. So we have a lot of student impact events where some of them are limited, some of them now do trigger email notifications, and that's limiting, we know that. So we want to be able to make that sort of a stream that your notification channels can use to actually pick up important information that students need to know about, so you can send out consolidated SMSs and direct notifications and those sorts of things through your normal comms channels. So it'd be a bit of a hybrid of both, that all of your scheduled stuff would, yes, potentially live inside Allocate Plus and be able to be subscribed in, but then have those, particularly the impacting notifications that happen to students without them really doing anything explicitly, have those as a stream of notifications that you can pick up, not just relying on the subset that go as emails. I think that's something that'll be, there's quite a few unis that are starting to look at that as using that stream already. Yep. I was just going to mention one too. I know, Gareth, you mentioned the student interface, and I just want to capture it for this session so we add it to the list for later as well, and that's actually stuff that we've already talked about. A lot of the feedback we got during the morning was around the workflow. Can it tell me a bit earlier if it's going to end up in a clash? And that's absolutely on our radar. We just need to work out a little bit of when the calculations need to happen, because there's a little bit of overhead to that. But I just wanted to capture that because I know a few people did mention it, and we want to make sure that we've got that on our list as well. Did you have another one, Gareth? Or Sabrina, you got the microphone now.
Yeah, mine's a bit simple. So changing the allocation modes of subject based on the study period. So say instead of study periods are open in preference entry, and it's timetabled newly, and it automatically comes in at read-only, but it can pick up the study period and go, well, it's in preference entry mode as a majority.
So almost a rules-based default.
Yeah, because one of the issues we have, the faculties forget to
Yeah.
turn them on to the study, to the mode that it
So-
should be in, and we get student inquiries.
And obviously, and I'm sure people can kind of pick up, we've got a very conservative approach in the past with this, that we don't want to accidentally open a group that shouldn't be open. We'd rather have one closed that should be open than open that should be closed. So when we didn't have a lot of options, it was like, well, if we're going to set a default, it's going to be read-only at worst. We didn't want to go beyond read-only. But I think if we can add, it's almost like a conditional default.
Yeah.
If we can have that to say, well, if the subject that this activity group is in meets these certain criteria, then this is the mode we want, and you can manage that potentially. So you're right, when you're adding groups and changing what activity groups look like, you can be confident, I guess, that it'll match those conditional sets. So that's a really good suggestion, I think.
Thanks.
Nina, yes.
If you've got an activity which is, for example, scheduled at 10 o'clock, it's a 2-hour tutorial, but it's scheduled across 2 rooms.
Yep.
So they'll have 2 staff members, but 2 rooms. When it comes across to Allocate, it's only picking up the location from 1 room rather than the 2.
Okay.
So
We should be able to keep 2. So that might be, we might have a look at the integration of how we're picking up the data for you from your end. But yeah, we should be able to show that there's 2 locations. So multi-location on activity.
It shows the 2 locations, but you can only, it says the capacity's only for the 1 room rather than for the 2 combined.
Yeah, and actually this is one that's come up a little bit. So we have there's kind of a global setting that defines when you've got multiple locations on the same day, what do you want to do? Do you want to use the smallest capacity? Do you want to sum them up and use the sum of those capacities? Or do you want to use the largest capacity? And that's what we kind of don't have, that granular activity by activity type thing yet. It's really a global setting to say, well, if there's multiple locations or multiple sizes that have come in, then we can sum them up. So that's kind of a global set at the moment. What we are, and this is where we go into sort of the Plus Suite, Schedule Plus kind of thing. Schedule Plus can differentiate between the size of the activity, especially with things like co-teaching, where you've got multiple cohorts that are being taught together. Even where they've got multiple locations attached to them, the activity size is still the activity size. It's kind of a consolidated set. So it knows the difference between the size of the activity versus we don't have to have separate activities for the different locations in the Schedule Plus setup. So it's not like we have these 2 different sizes. So we've got more options the more we go down the Schedule Plus path. But I think if we look at that global setting, that's probably something that might be impacting your particular ones as well.
With the 1 activity, would you then change the plan size to the total number of enrolments?
Correct. Yeah, exactly. And then it'll know that the locations sort of work up for that as well. Yeah.
And the other one was the combinations with your constraints.
Yep.
So if you've got, for example, vet classes, they've got 10 groups of 6 students each. So with their pracs, their tutes, they might have 2 or 3 different. And if you select option 1 for the tute, tute A group 1, they have to go through
a particular sequence. Yep.
So previously you only had a choice of like 5 different combinations.
Yep.
Is that?
Yeah, so the 5 group limit on combinations, and this has been whenever I've had the conversation with people about, hey, sections, what do we really need them? It's like, well, can we do more than 5? Would be the question that comes up most often. We're actively looking at that. So we really did. We've kind of erred on the side of caution to just limit down so that it doesn't. And for that, I know there was a few people that sort of tested the early evolution of combinations, and it did grind quite hard if we tried to do larger groups. So we limited that back. We've added a lot of efficiency and performance underneath it as well. So we think certainly in the next 6 months we'll be able to increase that out so that there won't be a limit on necessarily the number of groups you can select. But once you actually start building those combinations, it'll be able to calculate just how complex and how big that becomes for the student. And if we start getting into a path where it becomes an unworkable combination, it'll stop you there. So being able to do a bit more of the calculation rather than just, at the moment it's a bit of a blunt limit to just say, well, if we limit you down to less than 5 groups, then maybe we're not going to reach that point where it's so complex that it doesn't break anything. But we recognise there are cohorts where we need more than 5 groups linked together. Even what you've described, as much as there's a lot going on there, it's still a fairly simple combination set. It's like once you select one, it follows you down a path. Yeah, and it might be that we start with the option to do linked combinations, so those automatic ones with more than 5 as a starting point, and then we'll look at where we can increase that for the more manual type combinations as well. But yeah, we're actively looking at that. So yeah.
with the new student interface, and this applies for all the others, I was just thinking, we have a lot of delivery at the moment that occurs across terms, so across different semesters, effectively. So you've got something in what we would schedule semester 1, but then a flexible term offering that the student was also doing as part of their pathway or program. At the moment, in the old interface, they were 2 separate
Grouped
items.
by semester, however you do it, yes, yep.
Is there a way potentially for us to display the subjects to the students based on a set of week patterns that we set up? So say if you're in between these ones, display those subjects to that student rather than by term.
In the existing student module, you mean?
Well, in any module.
We probably won't do a lot in the existing student module.
Well, I mean the new one potentially, because I didn't necessarily see the options for that when you.
Yeah, so we don't really have that concept of grouping them by teaching period, and that's quite deliberate. That it's more grouped by action required. So the things that need actions that are going to happen. If there's groups that are open for allocation and you haven't got an allocation, that'll be at the top of the list. So that's kind of the way it works at the moment. So the things that open progressively become more prioritised for the students. In terms of like saying, well, this is the set of activities that you need to work on now, that's again where I'm probably going to go a bit of plus suite and say, well, that'd be the timetable period that's active at that time. So anything scheduled within that timetable period, and it doesn't care about teaching periods. It just says, well, these are the active things that we're going to open or display through to Allocate Plus. So that's where we have that concept of a week range.
It becomes slightly an issue when we've got multiple of these terms
going
on where the students are in.
We don't have to have one timetable period active either, so we can have multiple timetable periods flowing through to Allocate Plus at any given time. So, and I know that's sort of going a bit over the territory we did yesterday, but that concept of everything that's sort of relevant for a student might start from here, but it could end at different paces. So you've got different timetable periods that sort of overlap each other potentially then too.
Which brings up the next question then. With the display all weeks, does it at the moment it currently displays everything even if it's active in semester 1? So
only future.
Only future? Good.
That's and I know I say that very quickly off the cuff because that's the intent, and I know that we were looking at only displaying future activities in there. So if you've got SEM 1 allocations and you've actually finished that, there's no value in that being part of the all weeks, what we used to call the all weeks display, the summary view. It should only be things that you still have either some activities still to run or you haven't started them yet. They would only be future things. Yes, Gareth.
Same exact thing that Warwick was talking about, but does that also then apply to the student allocation contexts?
Yes, it would. Absolutely. Okay. That's definitely what we'd want it to be able to do, is to be able to say, well, I don't really care about looking at context for activities that have already finished.
Yep.
That's kind of the point, isn't it? Yeah. Ada, yes. And then William's got another one as well. Yep.
Mine is kind of a cross between Schedule Plus and Allocate Plus about combinations. So yesterday you were talking about Schedule Plus and the multi-par.
Yep.
Right? How you can table a lecture and link to it, a lab. So I will assume this will be a way to have a workaround on simple activity combinations outside of Allocate Plus. Right?
Absolutely, yeah. So in those scenarios, I'll get you keep going, but I'll jump in on that little part because, yes, if we can set up an activity that has multiple different types that run in different weeks, so it's a lecture for every third week and it's a lab in the twos and fives and then it's a prac and it just has a different type and it's just that class set. So it's defined by the cohort, then those things are always linked together. So we wouldn't need to set up a combination because those activities are all part of the same activity.
That's what I was going
to do.
So
that's one scenario that it would be able to cover, yes.
Right. Perfect. Because I'm doing something similar with Syllabus Plus, but with Syllabus Plus it gets a little bit messy. That's why I'm using sections.
Yes, because you have to create extra templates to represent those different types, and that's where we get a bit stuck, The
issue I'm having with the combinations sometimes is when I modify anything in the templates, the combination doesn't update properly, namings or time. So if I did a combination and after say, the lab instead of a Wednesday, I want a Tuesday. In the past, when I was trialing, the combination braked. It didn't work.
Yeah, I think we've done some new calculations around that, so it may be improved on that. We probably could check some scenarios if we've looked at those particular cases.
I'm still using sections, so I wanted to see if. Look, to be honest, after the new interface, I think it will work pretty well with our sections, but I'm still worried about this combination breaking on the
100%. Yeah,
background when I update something.
totally. Yeah.
So I just, okay.
And that's the sort of ones we test quite a few of those types of scenarios, but we always know that there's scenarios out in the world that if you can even send us through the steps that happen, even if you want to raise a ticket and just put in, this is what we did, and in the past this broke combos, so we're freaking out about it.
You know when you go do combinations and you go to the admin, instead of sections, it says combination?
Yes, yep.
When I click there, it's disappeared. It's not there. The combination is not there.
When the
It's
group,
gone.
when you've made a change to the group in some way, it's still seen as part of a combination, but it's not.
So I
Okay,
do a
that
change
probably
on the
sounds like a
template.
data thing we can work through.
I do a
Yeah,
change on an activity. I'll make it 2 hours instead of 1, or change it day.
yeah,
The combination doesn't update.
yeah. No,
and
it should
after
be.
or
Yeah,
not.
so we'll have a look at that scenario, I reckon, because that's certainly not the design. Yeah, if you can replicate it in your current version, or even if you just tell us the steps and we can run through some different scenarios as well. We got, and I know I mentioned it this morning, we've got quite a big test team, so we can run through different scenarios and we give our guys a lot. Do you want to?
Yeah, we've got some testers in Allocate Plus that love combinations, love trying to
Absolutely.
break them. So
Yeah,
yeah.
And I say this as the person who's saying sections are, we're trying to move sections. We've got a few that are really into sections as well. So they've tried, and when I say they're into it, they've tried every way they can to break things. And we know that there's points where they break, where you do this plus that plus this plus that, it'll break. So we know that with sections and combinations, and I know you're thinking of probably Yogi's the one that loves doing this stuff. So so if we can even get a rough scenario, we'll try and pick up those types of tests rather than you have to go and replicate it as well. Yeah, William, yes.
Yeah, so an issue we have at UTS is just students receive way too many emails. Like there's some research they did saying like the first week after enrolling into subjects, they got something ridiculous, like 150 emails in 1 week.
Yep.
Talking to our student inquiry team and students themselves, they're saying like they often miss their timetable changes. So would there the possibility of being push notifications, that would require some kind of app or something, I suppose.
So this is where we're
Separate
talking
app.
about those streams.
Yeah.
So the concept of essentially saying, we're not going to rely on those emails anymore.
Yeah.
We're going to send you all the info based on everything that impacts that student. And then as a comms channel, you can decide, do we send them a daily, which could be like a summary of all the things that impacted you based on that day, or a weekly, or a push one for certain. So we've got different event types.
Okay.
So where it impacts the student and it's a certain type of change, we might say, yeah, all right, that's one that we put in the, and this is why it can be done through an API stream to be able to say, we want to put that in the category that sends an SMS right now.
Yeah.
Or we want to put it in the category that says, just bundle them all up and send an email at the end of the day. And
Or
to be
like
able to do
possibly
that.
like rolled into the alert, so as soon as they log on, they go, boom, these are all the changes that have
So the
happened.
alerts, the student alerts that we have on the screen, then they're absolutely part of that.
Okay, cool.
And if we think about, I don't know how many have sort of played around with the student alerts as they are now, those sort of templates that we can set up about what will trigger it and when, what we're going to add around that is the ability to say, well, and when we have people starting to use these feeds, is to say, well, we want this in the app, we want it to trigger an email, and we want it to go to the comms channel as well. So you'll be able to decide whether it shows in the app or whether it just goes through the comms channel. You can have different flavours for different types of events as well.
Ripper.
Yep. Cool.
I think it's on. Just some feedback on the new student interface. One of the things that I noticed when I was testing today is that I needed to scroll out, like zoom out of the window.
We saw that up
see
here as
enough.
well, yeah. I mentioned that to Matt during the break. I think we'll have to look at some of the way it handles some of the resolution around the place
maybe
as well.
that, or maybe the real estate that some things take up. Like one of the things that I mentioned to Suzanne was that for example, we can see the 7 a.m. time slot. We never have anything scheduled at 7, so maybe if we can configure that to not only limit within the hours that the university schedules within, potentially.
Yeah.
So if there's nothing before 8, don't even show anything on the calendar before 8.
And I know with the libraries we use for that, we can sort of set the starting point, but then if there's activities in there, it will expand. So you can kind of have a bit of that flexibility too. So I'm sure that's something we can look at.
Yeah, and
definitely.
one of the other things around that was just sort of, I noticed when I was trying to drag and drop onto the screen, if I couldn't see the time slot where it was meant to be. So if I could only see up until 3, but there was something between 5 and 6,
it's
I
5
couldn't
o'clock.
put it in there. I couldn't scroll, so I just kind of had to drop it and hope for the best, or click on the side and scroll. So there was just a lot of scrolling between the timetable grid, the list of activities, particularly when there were multiple options.
Yep.
And then there were sort of 2, I guess, maybe this is just a me thing, but 2 scroll buttons right next to each other, like the activity list and then the whole window list. And managed to scroll in the wrong one, the one that I wasn't looking to scroll
no,
through.
that's really good. Yeah, we want to be able to see that stuff.
Yeah, so just some usability stuff, I guess. And just one other thing in terms of the sort of the workflows, when I was trying to work through some of the workflows, I felt they looked a little bit too busy in terms of how much information I could see as a student. So maybe if we could configure how much of that information they see, whether it's just the day and the time.
Almost like the grid settings where you can say, what do you want to have in there?
Yeah, so that you can say, if I don't care what room it's in, I don't care, like if there's enough information that just says, for me, for example, I might just want to know that it's on Monday at 9 a.m. That's my first preference. Tuesday at 9 a.m. is my second preference, for example, because when you went back and looked at it, I just felt like it was too much information and it was a bit busy for me to go, this was my preference 1 of this workflow.
I think that's a good point.
And this was my preference 2. So even if you could give
when
students
you're reviewing
the
them all
option,
together, it looks quite a lot, doesn't it?
Give them the option to go, even if they could maximise or minimise would be another option too. So they go, if I want to know more information about that, I can. Or maybe to give us the options in terms of how we configure that. Because for some institutions, they might want to see that. For others, they might not.
And I think that's where we probably sort of defaulted it to the full activity view rather than the in-between one that we have for the normal activity selection.
The day, the time, the number of seats, who was teaching it. I don't necessarily want to know that information.
Not during the workflow.
Not for the preference part anyway. I think.
What's already scheduled visible as well, so you know, well, it's not going to work at 9 o'clock Monday. Because I've already got subject then. I have to go all the way through and then get that.
Then find out at the end, and that's what we're talking about. Is we want to have those calculations happening almost on each step of the workflow to say, well, okay, based on that one, now is there anything else I shouldn't be picking, whether it's clashing with this or not part of it? Not at the moment, it just follows the combination rules, and then at the end says, well, did any of that work? And we're just trying to find the balance of how we want to keep it quick and sort of active for the students, but we also want to make sure it gives them all the information they need as well. So we can see those things already, and it was really good to have a large group of people use it as well, to be able to sort of see, these are the types of things that everyone comes across. I'm not sure if it's our demographic that's necessarily using this thing all the way through, but that's okay. We've got a few that are, as Matt was saying, like we've got plenty that are recent that are kind of going, we know that this will work well too. So I think there was a question. Oh yeah, Donna had a question. Of course you did. Sorry.
Me again. Just thinking about mandatory attendance. There are some times when we have to have a student moved later. So after we've closed down after 2 weeks, students can't move. But there may be staff that then have to request for the student to be moved, and it might be for an accessibility issue or something. There's no provision to actually record why that move is happening.
Yeah, okay.
And it also, I think, needs to be showing the student the reason why they're moving for their mandatory attendance, because they might have forgotten about the discussion, or it could have been accidentally done to the wrong student. So
would you be thinking that you'd want that, and I'm just thinking from our sort of data perspective, that we'd want to specify certain activity groups that if a student gets moved after attendance gets recorded once, that we want to have this sort of action trigger, or would you want to have it across sort of all activity groups at all times? Because I guess we don't want it to hit every staff allocation that gets made, because that's going to be too much. It's just where it impacts that mandatory attendance, isn't it?
Where it only impacts the mandatory attendance, where you've actually tagged off that those particular courses are mandatory attendance. They're the only ones that, because obviously we've talked about this, where if you're moving students to various different classes, or they're moving themselves in the first 2 weeks, their mandatory attendance is staying with them even if they're in a different class list. But if it's happening later down the track, and there could be, for all we know, there could be 3 moves after week 2, for whatever reason, for this poor student that might be going through some very difficult situations. But sometimes, when you're looking at that, it might prompt the course coordinator.
And we might be able to look. We might be able to look at so if we, as you say, tag an activity group as being part of this, we'll call it mandatory attendance, just for the sake of it. That then maybe it's once if a student is moved and it's in read only, then there needs to be a note attached to it. So it's almost like when we do buffers. Under a certain scenario, you put a buffer and you need a note. If you do move a student that's allocated when the group is in read only, you need to put a note against it. That might be a simple way to start with it. But it's more about, I guess, for us, it's thinking too about how do we determine which groups that applies to. So is it just a matter of, a tag. So do we need to think about tags at activity groups? Or is it better to actually have a function that we say, let's mark these groups as requiring mandatory attendance, and then we can fit them into a different category across the whole suite as well. So we can say this group as scheduled is defined as mandatory attendance, because that might impact how we do some timetabling around it too.
Correct.
Yeah.
And what I was thinking was as well, like obviously course coordinators, when they're running the class list to determine, say, the 80% application of where they need to load, they would be maybe having an understanding of why that student was having difficulty. If they can see those notes, they'll remember, oh, that's the reason I understand what I did for that student because of these situations. And I think that's hard when they can't see it. So I think whatever we try and do in this area, it needs to be visualised for also the staff coordinator that's trying to look after the mentoring.
Yeah, and I think that's where we probably just would need to almost abstract out where the note against that needs to reside. So it's when you're looking at a student record, when you're looking at an activity record, when you're looking at attendance reports, you might need it in even all of those locations potentially. Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Cool.
I feel like I might have missed a detail. So when we were looking at the interface, one of the things that popped out was that there was a other activity that was not a timetable. Is that correct?
Yes, I think we did have an external student activity in there, didn't you?
Yeah, so I think all the students had at least one external activity there. So they did have one.
So how does that arrive? Where does that come from?
Yeah. Do you want to go? Yeah, go for it.
Either way. So that came through the external activities file itself. So I actually went through and per student, I went through and created external activities for those students and the details that surrounded those. So what they were, what time they were. It actually has a week pattern associated with it as well. And those kind of things. So I went in one by one and created those myself.
Yeah, so it's an existing function. Not everyone uses it a lot. Often it's where we've got integration with a placement system or something similar, that it'll come in as almost like an activity that is pre-allocated just for that student. So it's a student-based activity, which is not that dissimilar to what we were talking about, those kind of opt-in, opt-out type stuff that we can potentially, with Schedule Plus, start scheduling those things and assigning students to them rather than having to have them feed through a third sort of integration, which is the current requirement at the moment.
So my actual linked question...
Yes, there's clearly a linked question off there for those extra activities.
Is that sometimes we've talked about having students having the ability to put in a soft constraint in their timetable for times that they want to block out.
Yep.
Is that that they can go, I have a job on Friday afternoons, but the only tutorial is Friday afternoon, so too bad, too sad.
Yep.
But to be able to avoid it if we possibly can, for that student to be able to say, avoid Friday afternoons if we can.
Yep. Yeah, and that's something that, and I probably should have almost put it in the buckets, because that's something I've talked about a lot with a lot of people, is the concept of, now that we've got this sort of new interface, a new world and a new way of thinking about preferencing and how students are building their timetables, that maybe at some point student preferences is almost two-part, where we've got the current thing that we call student preferencing, which is there's a timetable, which ones do you like, versus what are your actual preferences? Where would you like mornings? Would you like afternoons? Do you have some times that you just would prefer not to do? So being able to get that, and this is where I know Rohit would it sort of matches into the stuff we talk about with the demand-driven scheduling, that we can get that potentially with the time efficiencies that we can gain with Schedule Plus being able to do stuff quickly, is that we can pick up those preferences and say, well, we can actually assign them to our planning students to say, well, we've got these students that have these type of common requests that come through, that we've got, 10% of our students work on a Friday afternoon, they've got it as a soft, so it becomes a soft constraint for that planning student. So we can actually build a timetable then that takes that into consideration, so that then those cohorts have options that they can preference properly. And that's where I think we can do 2 layers to preferencing at some point. Yeah. And we're a little way off that. It's just a matter of using that as a concept for preferences that aren't about the activities we've already scheduled, and that's probably the base kind of line of it. Yeah. Okay, group with a bunch of selections. Yes? Oh, where you've got multiple at the same time?
Yeah, if you've got multiple in the same time,
yep.
Well, sometimes what we find is that if you hover over one, the one you're hovering over...
Sorry guys, we'll work through this one as well.
The one you're hovering over, might be off the page. Like
Yeah.
if it's a long list of 20 activities or something, and we kind of want it to actually roll down to that spot.
I think
on the
you're right
list.
there, and this probably goes a little bit to Bron what you were talking about too, is that when you're kind of looking, comparing your list of activities to what's on the grid, like that one's down at 4. If I was up here, I look at some of these ones and they disappear. Some of them are down off the bottom of the screen. So I think
Yeah.
you're right, if we can kind of shift them to that and show them where they're looking
and
at.
sometimes
that
you
might
need
make
the
sense.
grid to shift to match.
That's what I'm thinking, the
you're
grid
highlighting
might
on the
actually move
right.
then. Yeah.
But sometimes you need the list on the right to shift.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think we're having some relationship there as well. It'd be good.
Yeah. When you're in, I'll just see what else there is. If you can you just go into the timetable?
Yeah, I'm in the timetable. This student hasn't got any allocations yet, but that's
yeah,
okay.
so
we can
when you've
allocate.
got, actually even there, see the way there's, just under the heading of timetable, there's the thing to toggle between grid and list.
Yep.
That one. In the old UI, those two buttons are actually joined together in the middle, so it made it more obvious that it was a choice between two things.
Okay. Yeah, that's a good point.
But even what we found is when I showed it to some people at work, then people just didn't realise that that was for grid view and list view, and it was the same problem that they had in the old UI. And so they just didn't realise that they could go to a list view instead.
Yep.
But see the way you've got summary is actually a little toggle, and it actually says summary, and you slide it back and forth. I know that you kind of like having icons. Instead of those two icons, could we just have list and grid with a slider? I don't know whether that would be easier for other people.
Yeah.
Just actually say grid and list. And
Look,
then it would be
it's
obvious
interesting
that
too, 'cause
I slide from one to the other.
Yeah, and I'd be interested in what others think. And it's a really interesting one because we do have, we have these thoughts and we have these suggestions. We put the design in, we put it to the groups of like student sample sets, and they go, nah, need icons, it's all about icons, and we're like, oh, okay. So it's a bit of finding that balance of what is intuitive for a student, what they're used to doing, versus like we look at it and go, oh, that makes more sense because it's got the words and it's got the toggle. But yeah, we're not averse to changing any of that.
I mean, because this was specifically student feedback, was that they didn't understand what the icons, or they didn't realise what the icons were. And that's why I thought if they actually just said grid and list instead of icons, then they'd either click on them or they'd toggle between the two.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Cool.
For the... Sorry, I do...
Yeah, you got a spreadsheet there. So you can always send it through to us too, Daniel. I know everyone's going to be hanging for dinner tonight.
I can, but then I don't get to show you on the screen.
While you're getting that up too, I just wanted to, just before... Sorry, everyone, just as we're doing these last couple, because I know we're getting close to time, and I'm not trying to interrupt Daniel here, but I just wanted to actually, and I know I mentioned it a little bit this morning, but I just wanted to acknowledge my team, because this Allocate Plus team is amazing. They're like unreal, and the stuff that these guys do is just so good. And Matt today, I can't thank you enough, mate. Well done.
Yeah.
And I know the rest of the team isn't here today, but I know they're all the work that they've done behind the scenes, particularly around student interface and all the stuff that they do. Like, a few people were saying to me, like, I go and chat with everybody and I'm talking, and I go, oh, how do you remember all this stuff? How do you know all? I'm like, I actually don't. These guys know it, and they're the brains behind me. So the only reason I can talk with some kind of confidence about what our app does is because of what all these guys do. So, I just really appreciate you guys. Really well done.
Yes.
Go, Daniel, sorry.
With the iCal link, we always have students not being able to find that. And I see it's now, it wasn't in version 24.2, and now I see it's in settings.
Yes.
If you activate it.
Yes, I haven't got it on in this environment, I think.
When you activate it and it goes into settings, it used to be in the home page, but either way, in the home page, students would do all their timetable. They'd have their timetable up on the screen, but they wouldn't go back to the home page.
Yes.
And in this case, I'm worried that students won't go to the settings.
Yeah.
So could it actually be somewhere where they're looking at their timetable and then they see it on that same page or something like that, or they see a link to it there?
Look, we had that kind of concept, and we actually had contemplated in the old one. I don't know if you remember, it actually had an export option, which was iCal back years ago. But that whole concept of did they get the link, did they download the file? We didn't want to go down that path again. But I think having a little bit of like linkage to go get your iCal to be able to subscribe, I think from the other screens makes sense.
Yeah.
So we'll probably expand that a little bit. Really what we've done for certainly this first iteration is that we just want to have the ability to do it, and then we'll expand where you can access it from.
Yeah.
And I think even within here, it'd be like take you to the settings to copy the link. I think that's what we want to be able to do. And that's fine as long as you can get to it. I think
just so they see
make it visible. Yeah. And we could probably even have the concept of having almost like a pinned alert. If a student hasn't subscribed or they've never clicked it, have an alert there. So we can have those sorts of concepts that we might be able to think about in the future too.
Yeah. The campus, in places there, we found there was the campus code where we actually really wanted it to be the description.
Okay, yeah, and that's probably, that could well be oversight sort of stuff too, that we want to make sure that we get it in all the spots.
Multi-part classes, we found it was really hard to work with, but I don't know whether you'll have an example.
I don't think I've got one right here in front of us, but multi-parts we do want to work through that they are consistent in the way that they do it. So, we're always looking at trying to improve that stuff.
All right.
Cool. All right, well, I do... take it off him. So I know we're technically at the end of the day now, so I want to thank all of you guys as well. This is the reason we do these conferences, so we can have these conversations, so we can share ideas. I appreciate everyone's input. So thanks a lot, and I'll see you all at dinner tonight, those that are going. And I think, Rohit, you probably want to close the day. So thanks again, everyone.